The fluorescent lights of St. Vincent's Community Hospital hummed softly overhead, casting a pale, steady glow down the quiet hallway. It was just past midnight, and the usual daytime bustle had faded into a hush. Only the occasional beep of a monitor, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, and the low murmur of voices from the nurse's station broke the silence. In room 314, a new patient lay propped up in bed, staring at the ceiling with tired eyes. She was an older woman, silver hair neatly combed, hands folded gently over the thin hospital blanket. Her name was Miriam, and she'd been admitted earlier that evening after a fall at home that left her with a fractured hip. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving, not because she wouldn't, but because she couldn't. Miriam was deaf, and no one on the evening shift had realized it until she shook her head firmly at every spoken question, her expression growing more frustrated by the minute. Down the hall, a young nurse adjusted the strap of her stethoscope and checked the clipboard in her hands. She was small in stature, with warm brown eyes that always seemed to hold a quiet kind of worry, as if she were constantly bracing herself for something to go wrong. She moved carefully, almost apologetically, as though she didn't want to take up too much space in the world. Her name wasn't important to most people, just another name on a rotating schedule. But to her patients, she was someone who noticed the little things, the way someone winced when turning in bed, the slight tremor in a hand reaching for water, the unspoken fear behind a forced smile. She'd grown up in a modest apartment above a laundromat, raised by her grandmother after her parents passed away when she was just 6. Her grandmother, who'd lost her hearing in her 20s due to an illness, never let her disability define her. She cooked, gardened, told stories with her hands, and taught her granddaughter not just how to sign, but how to listen. With eyes, with patience, with presence. That lesson had stayed with the young nurse all her life, and it was part of why she'd chosen nursing in the first place. Not for the prestige or the paycheck, but because she believed everyone deserved to be seen, especially when they felt invisible. She glanced at the patient assignment sheet again. Room 314, new admission. Female 78, hip fracture. No known allergies. And then, in small handwriting at the bottom, patient appears nonverbal. Possible cognitive delay? Await neuroconsult. She frowned. That didn't sound right. She'd seen that kind of note before. Hasty assumptions made in the rush of triage. Something in her gut told her to look closer. She pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small lamp near the bed. Miriam turned her head slowly, her eyes sharp and watchful. The nurse smiled. Not too wide, not too eager. Just a soft, calm curve of the lips meant to say, "It's okay. I'm here to help." She walked over to the bedside, set the clipboard down, and then did something unexpected. Instead of speaking, she raised her hands. "Hello," she signed, fingers forming the familiar shape with gentle precision. "My name is..." "I'm your nurse tonight." Miriam's eyes widened. For a moment, she just stared, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then slowly, her face softened. The tension in her shoulders eased. She lifted her own hands, shaky at first, and signed back. "You know sign?" The nurse nodded, her own hands moving fluidly. "Yes. My grandmother was deaf. She taught me." A small, relieved smile tugged at Miriam's lips. She signed, "No one here understood me." They kept talking louder, like that would help. The nurse almost laughed, but caught herself. She knew that feeling all too well. The well-meaning but misguided attempts to fix communication by shouting, as if volume could bridge a language gap. "I'm sorry," she signed. "That must have been frustrating." Miriam nodded, then gestured toward her hip. "Hurts," she signed simply. "I know," the nurse replied. "The doctor said it's a clean break. You'll need surgery tomorrow, but for now we'll keep you comfortable. I'll give you your pain medicine soon, okay?" Miriam gave a small thumbs up. Then hesitantly she signed, "Are you staying?" The question caught the nurse off guard. It wasn't just about the shift. It was a plea for connection, for someone who wouldn't disappear the moment the paperwork was done. "Yes," she signed back. "I'll check on you often. And if you need anything, just press the call button." "I'll come." Miriam's eyes glistened. She reached out and lightly touched the nurse's wrist. A silent thank you. Outside the room, unnoticed in the shadow of the doorway, a man stood frozen. He'd arrived just minutes earlier, having canceled 2 meetings and rerouted his driver on a whim. He rarely came to the hospital. Too many memories, too much guilt. But something about his mother's voice on the phone earlier that day, the quiet resignation in her typed messages, had gnawed at him. So he'd come, hoping to see her settled, maybe bring her favorite lavender tea from the shop downtown. He hadn't expected this. He watched as the young nurse leaned slightly forward, her hands moving with quiet grace, her expression open and kind. He saw his mother, usually so reserved, so guarded with strangers, relax in a way he hadn't seen in years. Not since his father died. Not since the world started treating her like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. He knew a little sign language himself. He'd taken classes after his mother lost her hearing in her 60s, determined to stay connected. But his signs were stiff, textbook perfect but lacking warmth. He always felt like he was performing, not communicating. And now, watching this stranger, this quiet nurse with tired eyes and rolled-up sleeves, speak to his mother like they'd known each other forever, he felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't interrupt. He didn't introduce himself. He just stood there hidden in the dim hallway watching something rare and real unfold. His mother laughed softly at something the nurse signed, actually laughed, and the sound, though silent, seemed to fill the whole corridor. After a few more minutes, the nurse gently patted Miriam's hand, signed "Rest now," and turned to leave. As she stepped into the hallway, she nearly jumped. There he was, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark overcoat that looked far too expensive for a hospital visit. His eyes were intense but not unkind. He looked like someone used to being in control, but right now he just looked moved. "Hi," he said quietly, voice low so as not to disturb the quiet of the floor. She nodded, suddenly shy again, her hands dropping to her sides. "Hello, you sign?" he said, more statement than question. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft. "A little." "A little?" He almost smiled. "You were fluent. My mother. She hasn't smiled like that in months." She looked down, suddenly self-conscious. I learned from my grandmother. It's nothing special." "To her it is," he said simply. "Thank you." She nodded again, unsure what else to say. "She's in good spirits." "That's a good sign before surgery." He glanced back into the room where his mother was now lying back, eyes closed but face peaceful. "Yeah," he murmured. "It really is." There was a pause. He wanted to ask her name, to thank her properly, maybe even offer something, money, a gift, anything to show his gratitude. But something in her posture, the way she held herself like she was trying to disappear into the wall, told him that grand gestures would only make her uncomfortable. So he just said, "I'm her son." She looked up surprised. "Oh, I didn't realize." "No one ever does," he said with a small wry smile. "I don't visit as much as I should." She didn't judge. She just nodded. "She talks about you in signs. She's proud." His breath caught. He hadn't known that. He'd assumed she was disappointed in him, too busy, too distant, too caught up in a world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals to remember the woman who raised him alone after his father's sudden heart attack. Before he could respond, a voice called from down the hall. "Hey, you got a minute? We've got a code gray in 212. The nurse's expression shifted instantly, professional, focused. "I have to go." "Of course," he said quickly. "Don't let me keep you." She gave a small wave and hurried off, her sneakers silent on the floor. He watched her go, then turned back to his mother's room. He stepped inside and sat in the chair beside her bed. She opened her eyes and signed, "That was your nurse?" "No," he signed back slowly. "That was my angel." Miriam smiled and closed her eyes again. He stayed for another hour, holding her hand, watching her sleep. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked down the hallway one last time, as if hoping to catch another glimpse of the nurse who'd done in 10 minutes what he hadn't managed in 10 years. Back at the nurse's station, the young nurse finished charting the code gray, a minor fall, no injuries, and took a deep breath. Her shift still had 4 hours to go, but something about tonight felt different, lighter. She glanced toward room 314, wondering if the son would stay, if the mother would sleep well, if tomorrow's surgery would go smoothly. She didn't know who the man was, just another worried family member probably. She didn't know his name, his title, or that his face appeared on the covers of business magazines. And she certainly didn't know that this quiet moment, this simple act of signing hello to a lonely woman in a hospital bed, would ripple outward in ways she couldn't imagine. All she knew was that someone had needed to be heard, and for once, she'd been there to listen, and that was enough. For now. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the hospital's east wing, painting golden stripes across the linoleum floor. The night shift had handed over to day staff, and the quiet hum of the overnight hours gave way to the steady rhythm of daytime activity. Rolling carts, ringing phones, the soft chatter of nurses coordinating care. In room 314, Miriam sat up in bed sipping warm tea from a paper cup, her eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. She'd slept deeply for the first time since her fall, and though her hip still ached, something inside her felt lighter. She kept glancing at the door, half hoping to see that quiet nurse again, but it wasn't the nurse who walked in a little. After 9, it was her son. He came in carrying a small paper bag from the bakery downtown, the one that made the almond croissants she loved. He set it on the bedside table and pulled up a chair, careful not to make too much noise. "Brought you something," he signed, a little awkwardly but with clear effort. Miriam's face lit up. She reached for the bag and signed, "You remembered." "Of course I did," he replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "She was here last night." Miriam knew exactly who he meant. She nodded slowly, her expression softening. "She sees me," she signed. "Not just the old woman with the broken hip. Not just your mother. Me." He looked down at his hands. "I wish I could talk to you like that." "You can," she signed gently. "You just have to stop thinking so much. Stop worrying about getting it perfect. Language isn't about perfection. It's about heart." He swallowed. That was something his father used to say, back when they were all still under one roof, back when laughter filled the house more than silence. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that until last night, watching a stranger speak to his mother with ease, with warmth, with no agenda other than kindness. They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, Miriam nibbling her croissant, him watching the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. After a few minutes, he asked, "What's her name?" Miriam shook her head. "She didn't say, but she wears a silver locket, and she signs with her left hand." He remembered that detail, the locket slightly tarnished resting just above her scrubs. He'd noticed it when she leaned over to adjust the IV pole. Later that afternoon, after making sure his mother had everything she needed, he walked down to the nurse's station. He didn't barge in or flash a business card. He just stood politely at the edge of the counter, waiting until a nurse with kind eyes and tired shoulders looked up from her chart. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I was wondering, do you know which nurse was assigned to room 314 last night? The one who knows sign language?" The nurse studied him for a moment, then recognition flickered in her eyes. "Oh, you're Miriam's son," he nodded. "She's on days now," the nurse said. "But she was here last night, yeah. Quiet girl. Always double-checks meds, always stays late if someone's in pain. Her name's, well, I shouldn't give it out, but she's the one with the locket, right?" He smiled faintly. "That's her." The nurse hesitated, then said, "Look, I don't know who you are, and it's not my place, but that girl? She's special. She volunteers at the Deaf Community Center on Saturdays, teaches kids sign language for free, doesn't do it for praise, doesn't even tell people." He felt something shift inside him, like a door opening he didn't know was closed. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for telling me." He didn't ask for her name again. He didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, he went home, not to his penthouse overlooking the city skyline, but to the old house he'd kept all these years, the one his parents had lived in until his father passed. It sat quiet on a tree-lined street, its porch sagging slightly, the garden overgrown. He hadn't been inside in nearly 2 years. Too many memories, too much guilt, but today he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the sunlight. The furniture was still covered in sheets. He walked straight to the study, where his father's old desk sat untouched. In the bottom drawer, behind a stack of tax returns from 2008, he found what he was looking for. A small, worn notebook filled with his father's handwriting. Sign language, beginner's phrases, the cover read. He sat down and flipped through the pages. His father had tried to learn too after Miriam's hearing began to fade. He'd practiced every night, stumbling over signs, laughing at his own mistakes. "It's not about getting it right," he'd say. "It's about showing up." His son had been too busy then, building his company, chasing deals, thinking there'd always be more time. Now, Sitting in that quiet house, he opened a fresh notebook and began to write. Not business strategies, not quarterly projections, simple signs. Thank you. I'm here. You matter. He practiced in the mirror that evening, his movements stiff at first, then slowly growing more fluid. He recorded himself on his phone, compared it to online tutorials, corrected his hand shapes. It wasn't about fluency, it was about trying. The next day he returned to the hospital earlier than usual. He didn't go straight to his mother's room. Instead, he lingered near the staff entrance, watching as nurses came and went during shift change. And then he saw her, walking in with a travel mug in one hand, her silver locket catching the morning light. She looked tired but calm, her steps steady, her eyes scanning the hallway like she was already thinking about who might need her. He almost called out, but something stopped him. She seemed so ordinary, so human, and he didn't want to be the man in the expensive coat who made her nervous. He remembered how she'd shrunk into herself when he'd spoken to her last night, not out of fear, but out of habit. Like she'd learned long ago that attention, especially from people like him, usually came with strings. So he stayed back, watched from a distance as she checked in at the station, greeted her co-workers with quiet smiles, and then headed toward room 314. He followed a few minutes later, giving her space. When he peeked in, he saw her sitting on the edge of his mother's bed, not as a nurse, but as a friend. She was signing slowly, showing Miriam how to do a gentle ankle rotation to improve circulation. Miriam was laughing, actually laughing at something she'd signed, her hands moving with surprising energy. He stood in the doorway, unnoticed. He watched how the nurse's voice softened even when she spoke aloud to another staff member passing by, how she tucked the blanket around Miriam's shoulders without being asked, how she made sure the call button was within easy reach before she left. After she stepped out, Miriam looked up and saw him. She signed, "She's coming back after rounds." "I know," he signed back. Then hesitantly, "Do you think she'd mind if I sat with you while she's here?" Miriam's eyes twinkled. She doesn't mind anyone, but she notices everything. That stayed with him. Over the next few days, he began visiting more often, not just in the evenings, but during the day, during her shift. He never interrupted her work. He'd sit quietly in the corner, reading or pretending to check his phone, but really just watching. He saw how she remembered small things, that Mr. Jenkins in 309 liked his water with a straw bent just so, that Mrs. Alvarez in 312 got anxious before blood draws and needed a distraction, that the new intern kept mixing up medication times and needed gentle correction, not scolding. And with his mother, she was different, lighter, more herself. She'd started writing little notes in a journal again, something she hadn't done since his father died. One afternoon, he found her scribbling furiously, her face full of concentration. "What's that?" he signed. She held it up. It was a list. "Things I want to teach my nurse." At the top, "How to make my famous lentil soup." Below it, "The story of my wedding day." And at the bottom, in slightly shaky letters, "Why I named my son after the moon." He felt his throat tighten. He hadn't known she still thought about those things, hadn't known she still wanted to share them. One evening after the nurse had left for the day, he asked Miriam, "Why her? Why does she reach you like this?" Miriam thought for a long moment. Then she signed, "Because she doesn't see my silence as empty. She sees it as a language, and she speaks it like she means it." He went home that night and practiced signs until his hands ached. He also made a call, not to his assistant, not to his PR team, but to the hospital's administration. He didn't reveal who he was. He just said he was a grateful family member and wanted to help improve care for deaf patients. He suggested better training, visual alert systems, maybe even hiring a part-time ASL interpreter for the floor. The administrator was surprised but grateful. "We've wanted to do more," she admitted. "But funding's tight." "I'll cover it," he said simply. Anonymously, he didn't do it for credit. He did it because he finally understood. His mother hadn't just needed medical care. She'd needed dignity, and someone had given it to her without even knowing the weight of what she'd done. A week passed. Miriam's surgery was scheduled for Thursday. The night before, the nurse came by during her evening rounds, even though she wasn't officially assigned to Miriam anymore. She brought a small drawing, a child's sketch of a nurse and an older woman holding hands signed from Lily at the community center. "She says you're her hero," Miriam cried. Quiet tears, but real ones. The nurse stayed longer than she should have, signing reassurances, explaining the surgery step by step, answering every unspoken worry in Miriam's eyes. When she finally stood to leave, Miriam caught her hand and signed, "Will you be here when I wake up?" The nurse hesitated. "I'm on days tomorrow, but I'll try to stop by after my shift." Miriam nodded, comforted. From the hallway, her son watched it all, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a CEO. He didn't feel like the man who closed billion-dollar deals or gave keynote speeches. He just felt like a son, grateful, humbled, and finally beginning to understand what really mattered. He didn't speak to the nurse that night. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough. But as he walked to his car, he made a quiet promise to himself. When the time was right, he'd thank her properly. Not with money, not with grand words, but with action, with respect, with the kind of quiet support that didn't ask for anything in return, because that's what she'd given his mother, and that's what she deserved in return. The morning after Miriam's surgery, sunlight poured through the hospital windows like liquid gold, spilling across freshly made beds and gleaming IV poles. The procedure had gone smoothly, clean, quick, and without complications. Now Miriam rested in a recovery room, drowsy from anesthesia but stable, her leg carefully elevated, her breathing slow and even. Nurses checked her vitals every 15 minutes, adjusting monitors, smoothing blankets, whispering reassurances even though they knew she couldn't hear them. But one person didn't whisper. Later that afternoon, as the shift changed and the day crew settled in, the young nurse with the silver locket walked into the room. Not because she was assigned there, but because she'd promised. She'd stayed late after her own shift ended, traded a break with a coworker, and now stood quietly by the bedside, watching Miriam's chest rise and fall. When Miriam's eyes fluttered open, cloudy at first from the medication, the nurse didn't speak. She simply raised her hand and signed, "Welcome back." Miriam blinked, then focused. A slow, tired smile spread across her face. She lifted her fingers weakly and signed back, "You came." "Of course I did," the nurse replied, her signs gentle, unhurried. "How do you feel?" "Like I wrestled a bear," Miriam signed with a wry twist of her lips. The nurse chuckled softly. "That's normal. But you did great. The doctor said everything went perfectly." Miriam nodded, then glanced toward the door. "He's been here all morning," she signed. "My son, he didn't leave once." The nurse followed her gaze, remembering the man in the dark coat, the one who'd watched her so intently that first night. She hadn't seen him much since, though she'd heard whispers among the staff. Miriam's son is some big-shot businessman, owns half the tech buildings downtown, but he never acted like it. No entourage, no demands, no complaints. Just a quiet man who sat by his mother's bed and held her hand like any other son would. She didn't say any of that. She just signed, "He loves you." Miriam's eyes softened. "I know." He just forgot how to show it for a while. Over the next few days, something shifted, not just in Miriam's recovery, but in the rhythm of the whole floor. The young nurse continued to stop by during her breaks, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to sit and sign stories about her childhood, about her grandmother's garden, about the stray cat she'd adopted last winter, who now slept on her pillow every night. Miriam listened with rapt attention, her hands occasionally chiming in with questions or comments, her face more animated than the nurses had ever seen it. And her son? He kept coming. Not just in the evenings, but midday, early mornings, even during lunch hours. He brought books Miriam loved, old poetry collections, mystery novels with dog-eared pages. He brought photos from their family albums, showing her images of holidays long past, of his father grinning beside a Christmas tree, of himself as a boy with skinned knees and wild hair. He didn't just drop them off. He sat with her, turning the pages slowly, signing descriptions when words failed him, letting the silence between them fill with memory instead of emptiness. One afternoon, the nurse walked in to find them both laughing, really laughing, over a photo of him as a teenager attempting to bake a cake that had clearly collapsed. Miriam was signing rapidly, her hands flying with exaggerated gestures, and he was trying to keep up, his signs clumsy but earnest. When he noticed the nurse in the doorway, he didn't stop or stiffen. He just smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and signed, "She says I've always been terrible in the kitchen." The nurse smiled back. Some things never change. Miriam patted the bed beside her and the nurse sat down. For a while, the three of them just existed in that space, no roles, no titles, no expectations. Just a mother, a son, and a nurse who'd somehow become part of their quiet world. What the nurse didn't know was that her presence had sparked something deeper in the man who watched from the edges. He'd started asking questions, not of her, but of others. He called the Deaf Community Center one Saturday under a fake name, pretending to be a parent looking for classes. When they mentioned the volunteer who taught kids on weekends, he listened carefully, taking notes. He learned she arrived early to set up chairs, stayed late to clean up, and never accepted the small stipend they offered. She says it's her way of honoring her grandmother, the coordinator told him. He also discovered she lived in a modest apartment above a bookstore, rode the bus to work, and spent her rare days off visiting elderly patients who had no family. None of this surprised him. It only confirmed what he'd already sensed. She gave without keeping score. Meanwhile, Miriam's recovery accelerated. She began physical therapy, gripping the parallel bars with determination, her face set in concentration. The first time she took a step, her son stood nearby, ready to catch her, but it was the nurse who knelt beside her, signing encouragement, steadying her elbow, celebrating each small victory like it was her own. "You're doing amazing," she signed after Miriam managed 3 full steps. Miriam wiped sweat from her brow and signed back, "Only because you believe I can," that night. After the nurse left, Miriam turned to her son and signed, "Ask her," he frowned. "Ask her what? To help? With the hospital? With the deaf patients?" She'd say yes. And she'd do it right. He hesitated. "I don't want to put her on the spot. She's..." "Private? Then don't ask as the CEO," Miriam signed firmly. "Ask as the son who finally learned how to listen." He thought about that all the way home. The next week, changes began appearing on the floor, small at first, then more noticeable. New visual alert systems were installed in every room, flashing lights for call buttons, vibrating pagers for staff. Printed care plans now included simple ASL illustrations for common phrases like pain, water, and bathroom. Even the intake forms had a new checkbox. Preferred communication method, spoken, written, ASL other. Staff whispered about it. "Who's behind this?" Someone asked at lunch. "No idea," another replied. "But it's about time." The young nurse noticed too. She saw the new signs posted near the nurses' station, the ASL quick reference cards tucked into chart holders. She felt a quiet pride, not because she'd caused it, but because someone had finally paid attention. What she didn't know was that her son had quietly funded it all. He'd met with the hospital administrator again, this time revealing his identity. Not to boast, but to ensure the changes would last. "Make it sustainable," he'd said. "Train the staff. Hire interpreters for critical moments. And if you ever need more support, call me, directly." He didn't mention the nurse. Not yet, but he watched her closely. He saw how she lingered with deaf patients now. Not just Miriam taking extra time to explain procedures, to translate for families who didn't know sign. He saw how other nurses started asking her for help, how she taught them basic signs during coffee breaks, how her quiet confidence slowly grew. One rainy Tuesday, he arrived to find her sitting cross-legged on the floor of the therapy room, showing Miriam how to do seated stretches using a resistance band. They were both laughing, soaked in concentration and joy. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, just watching. After a while, Miriam noticed him and signed. "You're staring," he shrugged and signed back. "Can't help it." The nurse looked up then, startled. She quickly stood, brushing her scrubs. "Sorry, we didn't mean to." "You're doing great," he said, switching to spoken words so the therapist nearby could understand. "Really? The whole floor feels different since you started spending time here." She blushed, looking down. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said gently. "You're doing more than that. You're reminding people that care isn't just about medicine. It's about connection." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded and said, "I should get back to my rounds." As she walked away, Miriam signed to her son. "She doesn't see her own light." "Maybe not," he signed back. "But I do." Later that week, he did something he hadn't done in years. He attended a community event. Not a gala, not a product launch, but a small gathering at the Deaf Community Center. A potluck dinner for volunteers and families. He wore jeans and a plain sweater. No watch, no phone. Just a paper plate of store-bought cookies he'd awkwardly tried to pass off as homemade. He didn't go to be seen. He went to see her, and there she was, kneeling beside a little boy who was struggling to sign thank you to an elderly woman. She guided his small hands gently, her voice soft even though no one needed to hear it. Her locket glinted under the fluorescent lights. She looked tired but happy. At home, he didn't approach her. He just stood near the back, watching as she moved from group to group, helping, listening, smiling. For Mom read. The first time he saw her not just as his mother's nurse, but as someone with a whole life outside the hospital, a life built on quiet generosity. When he got home that night, he sat at his desk and wrote a letter. Not an email, not a memo, a real letter on thick paper in his own handwriting. He didn't say who he was at first. He just wrote about what he'd seen, the patience, the consistency, the way she made people feel seen. He wrote about his mother's smile, about the empty space that had finally been filled, and at the end he wrote, "If you're willing, I'd like to talk about how we can bring this kind of care to more people." Not as a favor, as a partnership. He didn't send it right away. He read it over and over, making sure it didn't sound like a transaction, making sure it sounded like gratitude, because that's what it was. And somewhere, in a small apartment above a bookstore, the young nurse curled up on her couch with a cup of tea, unaware that her simple act of signing hello had set something beautiful in motion, something that would soon ask her to step into a light she never thought she deserved. But for now, she just rested, her silver locket cool against her skin, her heart full from a day spent giving without expecting anything back. And that, for her, was enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was tucked inside her hospital mailbox, plain white envelope. No return address, just her name written in neat, careful handwriting. She almost missed it, buried under shift schedules and medication updates. But something about the weight of it, the quiet simplicity, made her pause. She opened it later during her lunch break, sitting alone in the small break room with a lukewarm cup of tea and the hum of the refrigerator, filling the silence. At first, she thought it was a thank you note from Miriam's son. She'd seen him more often lately, always respectful, always distant, never pushing. But this wasn't just a note. It was an invitation. The words were simple, but they carried weight. He wrote about how watching her care for his mother had changed something in him, how he'd spent years building a company that connected people through technology, yet had failed to truly connect with the one person who mattered most. He wrote about the new systems in the hospital, the training sessions starting next month, the growing awareness among staff. And then, near the end, "I'd like to meet with you, not as the person you might think I am, but as someone who wants to learn from you. There's a scholarship I'd like to create in your name, for nursing students who want to specialize in deaf healthcare, but I won't do it without your input. Your voice should shape it." She read it twice. Then a third time. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the sheer unexpectedness of it. No one had ever asked for her opinion like this, not really. Not in a way that felt like they truly meant it. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket next to her locket. All afternoon it weighed on her, not like a burden, but like a quiet promise waiting to be answered. 2 days later, she got a call from the head nurse. "You're needed in the administrator's office after your shift," the voice said. "It's about the new patient communication initiative." Her stomach flipped. She knew what this was. That evening, after finishing her rounds and signing off on her charts, she walked down the hall toward the admin wing. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her shoes scuffed, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She hadn't dressed up. She didn't know how to dress up for something like this. She just went as herself. The door was slightly ajar. She knocked softly. "Come in," a familiar voice said. She stepped inside. The room was tidy, sunlight still catching the edges of the blinds. Behind the desk sat the hospital administrator, a kind woman in her 50s who always remembered birthdays. And standing by the window, hands in his pockets, was Miriam's son. He turned when she entered. No suit today, just dark jeans and a soft-looking sweater. He looked less like a CEO and more like a person, tired maybe, hopeful, definitely. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quiet. She nodded, suddenly unsure what to do with her hands. "I got your letter." "I wasn't sure you'd say yes," he admitted. "I didn't say yes yet," she replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. He smiled faintly. Fair enough, the administrator stood. I'll give you two some privacy, she said gently, and slipped out, closing the door behind her. For a moment, they just stood there in the same room, finally face to face with no patients, no emergencies, no roles to hide behind. You've changed things here, he said finally, more than you know. I just did my job, she said, but you did it with your whole heart, he countered. And that's rare, she looked down. I learned it from my grandmother. She used to say, if you can't hear someone, learn to see them. He nodded slowly. My mother says the same thing. A silence settled between them, not awkward but thoughtful. Then he walked over to a chair and pulled it out for her. Please sit, she did. He sat across from her, not behind a desk, not in a position of power, just level with her. I want to create a scholarship, he began, for nursing students who want to learn ASL, who want to work with deaf and hard-of-hearing patients. I want it to be more than just money. I want it to include training, mentorship, real support. And I want your name on it, not because you're famous, but because you showed me what real care looks like. She swallowed. My name, but I'm nobody. You're somebody to my mother, he said gently, and you're somebody to every patient you've ever taken the time to truly see. She looked at her hands. What would I have to do? Help design it, he said. Tell us what matters. What gaps you've seen. What would have helped you when you were starting out? And if you're willing, help teach the first group of nurses in the hospital's new ASL program. She blinked. Me teach? You already do, he pointed out. You've been teaching our staff for weeks, just by example. She thought about it. About the new interns who now knew how to sign pain and water. About the older nurses who asked her to repeat signs slowly. About the little boy at the community center who'd signed thank you all by himself last week. Maybe she could do more. What if I'm not good enough? She whispered. He leaned forward slightly. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to care. And you already do. She took a deep breath, looked up at him, really looked. And for the first time, she didn't see a billionaire or a CEO. She saw a son who'd been lost, who'd found his way back through her small act of kindness. And in that moment, she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about making sure no deaf patient ever felt invisible again. Okay, she said softly. I'll help. Relief washed over his face. Thank you, but she wasn't done. On one condition, he raised an eyebrow. Name it. That this isn't about you giving me something. It's about us building something together. No fancy titles. No press, just real change. He didn't hesitate. Agreed. They shook hands, just two people making a promise, not a transaction. Over the next few weeks, they met regularly, not in boardrooms, but in the hospital cafeteria during off hours, in quiet corners of the library, once even at a park bench near the community center. They talked about curriculum, about hiring certified interpreters, about creating visual guides for common procedures. She shared stories from her grandmother's life, how doctors used to ignore her, how nurses would talk over her head as if she weren't there. He listened, really listened, taking notes, asking questions, never interrupting. He also started signing more. Not perfectly, but with effort. One afternoon, as they reviewed a draft of the training manual, he signed, "This is important." She smiled. "You're getting better." "I have a good teacher," he signed back. She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound surprised them both. Miriam, now nearly fully recovered and preparing to go home, watched these changes with quiet pride. She'd moved to a temporary rehab apartment near the hospital, and her son visited daily. One evening, as they sat on the small balcony watching the sunset, she signed, "You found your way back?" He looked at her, "Because someone showed me the path." Back at the hospital, the young nurse began leading short ASL workshops during staff meetings. At first, only a few nurses came, but word spread. Soon even doctors started showing up, curious, hesitant, but willing. She taught them not just signs, but how to get a deaf person's attention respectfully, how to maintain eye contact, how to slow down and be present. One day, a new patient, a teenage girl newly deaf after an illness, arrived scared and withdrawn. The nurse sat with her for an hour, signing slowly, sharing her own grandmother's story, showing her that silence didn't mean loneliness. By the end of the week, the girl was smiling, signing simple phrases, even helping other patients practice. That's when the nurse realized this was bigger than a scholarship. This was a movement, and she was part of it. The official announcement came a month later, The hospital held a small gathering in the main lobby. No cameras, no reporters, just staff, a few community members, and Miriam, standing proudly beside her son. The administrator introduced the new inclusive care initiative and then turned to the young nurse. This program exists because of someone who believed that every patient deserves to be heard even when they don't speak, she said. Please welcome the heart of this project. Everyone clapped. The nurse's face burned, but she didn't run. She stood tall, her locket gleaming under the lights, and signed a simple thank you to the room. Afterward, Miriam hugged her tightly. You did it, she signed. No, the nurse signed back. We did it. Later that night, as she walked to the bus stop, she passed a group of nurses practicing signs under a street lamp, laughing, correcting each other, trying. She smiled to herself. She still lived in the same small apartment, still rode the bus, still drank cheap tea and adopted stray cats. But something had shifted inside her. She wasn't just the shy nurse anymore. She was someone who'd been seen, and in being seen, had found the courage to step forward. And somewhere behind her, in a car parked down the street, a man watched her go, not with admiration from a distance, but with quiet respect, and the first flicker of something deeper, something that didn't need a title to matter. But that was a story for another day. For now, the work was enough, and so was she. 6 months had passed since that first quiet night in room 314, and the hospital felt different, not in a flashy way, but in the small, steady changes that added up to something real. Posters with ASL illustrations hung in every patient room. Nurses greeted deaf patients with practice signs instead of nervous smiles. Even the cafeteria staff knew how to point to menu items and sign hot or cold. It wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. And at the center of it all was the young nurse with the silver locket, now leading weekly training sessions and mentoring new hires who wanted to specialize in inclusive care. She still wore her scrubs, still took the bus, still kept her head down in crowds, but something in her posture had shifted. She stood a little taller now, spoke a little more clearly, not because she'd changed who she was, but because she'd finally realized her quiet way of caring wasn't weakness. It was strength. Miriam, meanwhile, had moved into a bright ground-floor apartment just a few blocks from her son's home. It was accessible, sunny, and filled with books, plants, and framed photos of her late husband. She'd even started hosting a small weekly gathering for deaf seniors from the neighborhood. Tea, cards, and plenty of signing. Her son came by almost every evening, not out of duty, but because he'd rediscovered the joy of simply being with her. They'd sit on the porch, watch the birds, and talk, really talk, using hands and eyes and heart. One Saturday morning, the nurse arrived at Miriam's apartment with a tote bag full of seed packets and gardening gloves. She'd promised to help plant herbs in the small backyard, a project Miriam had been dreaming about since spring. As they knelt in the soft soil, fingers brushing rosemary and thyme into the earth, Miriam signed, "You've given me more than care. You've given me back my voice." The nurse paused, dirt under her nails, and signed back, "You never lost it. You just needed someone to listen." Miriam smiled and patted her hand. Later that afternoon, as the nurse was about to leave, Miriam's son pulled up in his car, not the sleek black sedan he used for meetings, but an old slightly dented hatchback he'd kept from college. He got out carrying a cardboard box. "Thought you might need these," he said, handing it to the nurse. Inside were children's books, simple stories with ASL illustrations on every page. "For the community center," he explained. "I had them printed. No logo, no name, just for the kids." She looked up at him, surprised. "You did this?" "I learned from the best," he said, glancing toward his mother, who was watering the new basil plants. Their eyes met for a moment, just a second, but something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding, respect, the kind that grows slowly like roots in good soil. A few weeks later, the hospital held its first official graduation for the Inclusive Care Initiative. 12 nurses and 3 physical therapists stood in the small auditorium, certificates in hand, faces proud. The young nurse gave a short speech, not from a podium, but standing among them. "This isn't about being perfect," she said, voice steady. "It's about showing up, about seeing people, not just patients. My grandmother taught me that, and now I get to pass it on." Afterward, Miriam's son approached her. "You were amazing," he said. "I just told the truth," she replied. He nodded. Then hesitantly he said, "I've been thinking. This work shouldn't stop here. There are hospitals all over the country that don't have what we've built. What if we took it further?" She frowned slightly. "You mean, expand it?" "Not as a corporate project," he clarified quickly. "As a nonprofit. You'd lead it, I'd fund it, handle the logistics, but you'd shape the vision. We'd train staff, develop materials, partner with deaf organizations, make sure no one feels invisible in a hospital again." She was quiet for a long moment. The idea was huge, bigger than she'd ever imagined. But then she thought of the teenage girl who'd cried when someone finally signed, "I understand you." Of the elderly man who'd held her hand and signed, "Thank you," with tears in his eyes. Of her grandmother, who'd spent her life being talked over, ignored, dismissed. "Yes," she said finally, "but only if it stays true to the people it's meant to serve. No shortcuts. No empty promises." "Never," he said. They shook hands again, this time not as strangers, not as CEO and nurse, but as partners. Over the next few months, they worked closely, meeting in coffee shops, libraries, even once in the hospital garden during a rare sunny afternoon. They drafted mission statements, reached out to advocacy groups, tested training modules with real patients. He handled the legal and financial side with quiet efficiency. She shaped the heart of it, the human part. They argued sometimes about wording, about priorities, but always with respect. And slowly, something else grew between them. Trust. One evening, after a long planning session, they walked together to the bus stop. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the air cool but not cold. He carried her tote bag, now filled with lesson plans and children's drawings from the community center. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think success was about building something big. Now I think it's about building something that matters." She looked at him. "It matters because it's real," he nodded. "And you keep it real." She smiled just a little. "You're not so bad yourself." They reached the bus stop. He handed her the bag. "Be careful." "I will," she said. Then after a pause, "Thank you for believing in this. I didn't believe in this," he said gently. "I believed in you." The bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes. She stepped on, turned, and signed one word before the doors closed. "Tomorrow." He watched the bus drive away, then walked back to his car, a quiet warmth in his chest. The nonprofit launched that fall. They called it Seen and Heard, simple, clear, full of meaning. The first pilot program rolled out in 3 cities with plans to expand. The young nurse traveled to each site, training staff, listening to patients, adjusting the program based on real feedback. She still worked part-time at St. Vincent's, but now her role was bigger: mentor, teacher, advocate. Miriam came to every local event, always sitting in the front row, always beaming with pride. At one community open house, as the nurse demonstrated how to sign, "I'm here for you," to a group of new volunteers, Miriam turned to her son and signed, "She's finally found her place." He signed back. We both did. Months turned into a year. The nonprofit grew but never lost its soul. Donations came in, not just from him but from people who'd been touched by the work. A retired teacher sent a check with a note. "My deaf brother died in a hospital where no one understood him. Thank you for making sure others won't." A young nurse from another state wrote, "Because of your program, I learned ASL and now care for my own grandmother the way she deserves." And through it all, the bond between the two founders deepened, not with grand gestures, but with shared purpose, late-night calls, and the quiet comfort of knowing someone truly saw you. One spring evening, they stood together at a small community garden the nonprofit had helped fund, a green space where deaf and hearing families could gather, play, and connect. Children ran between raised beds, signing and laughing. Parents chatted on benches. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The nurse watched a little girl carefully show her grandfather how to plant a sunflower seed, her small hands guiding his wrinkled ones. She felt someone step beside her. "He'd be proud of you," Miriam's son said softly. She knew he meant her grandmother. "I hope so," she replied. They stood in silence for a while, watching the world they'd helped make a little kinder. Then he turned to her. "I never thanked you properly for that first night, for seeing her when no one else did." "You don't have to thank me," she said. You've spent every day since showing me what gratitude looks like, he smiled. Still, thank you, she met his eyes. You're welcome. And in that moment, under a sky just beginning to dim, something unspoken settled between them, not a promise, not a label, but a quiet understanding that they were in this together, for as long as it mattered. Later, as the event wound down, Miriam signed to her son. Ask her. He raised an eyebrow. Ask her what? To stay. He looked toward the nurse who was helping pack up folding chairs. She already has. Miriam chuckled and signed. Not for the work. For you? He didn't answer right away, but when he walked over to the nurse and offered to carry the last box to her car, his steps were a little surer, his voice a little softer. The story didn't end with a grand declaration or a dramatic twist. It ended as real stories often do, with small moments. A shared cup of tea after a long day, a text that said, "How's your week going?"